All right. Looks like we pulled it off.
We have pulled it off.
Welcome,
How's everyone?
Ron. Welcome, Christos. So you folks just wrapped up a live stream of how many hours? 3 hours?
Just 3 hours.
Just 3 hours. And then I was like, well, you know, while you're at it, let's just pull you over here and we'll just talk some more identity fun, right?
So, sure, why not?
Identity and fun. I like how you put it in the same sentence. That's what we're trying. That's what it's all about. Identity and fun.
Fun, air quotes. Fun.
Oh, come on, man. That's not called for.
Well, so I'm always, of course, scouting around what's new, what's exciting, what's happening with Asp Net. And when I was reading the latest release post for the latest preview, that was one of the features that was called out. And so I was thinking this is wonderful because I'm interested to see what's new. Christos, you've gotten super blurry.
I know. I think I went back and forth, and he didn't like the fact that
soft lighting
behind it. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it is.
I don't know. He looks kind of.
It's good there. It makes me look nice, right?
Yeah,
like
I'm an abstract.
Just the concept,
okay, well,
Christos.
Just the concept. Maybe I can stop my camera and put it back on again.
Who knows? Or
I think my Brio is just like I don't know what you're doing there.
Weird. They have a mind of their own. Mine this morning was kind of blurry. Okay, I'm going to hop over. You can play with your webcam. I'm going to switch over to community links for the week, and we'll dig right in. So here we go. As always, I share these links in the chat. I put them in the description. I will fax them to you. Everyone will get these links, so do not worry. Someone will still ask, but I'm just telling you now, these links will be shared. Okay. First of all, I try and group these, by the way. I don't know if it helps anyone else, but it helps me. So starting off with some Blazor links. And so this one's nice. Gerald, he's writing up about splitting code in Blazor components. So, you know, of course, the kind of standard when you do new Blazor component, you'll get everything. You'll get the HTML and the Razer code together. And that works in some cases, but in other cases, you may want to separate this out. And so he talks about, you know, that you can just, as long as you use partial classes, you can split that out. And talks about, you know, partial classes are nice. You can split code among multiple files. He also talks about configuring file nesting. So, you know, especially like in VS Code, you can configure how those are nested. So that's about it there. All right. Speaking also of Blazor, Matthew has a nice rundown of samples for teaching yourself Blazor. And so many of these are ones that we've already covered, but it's nice to see kind of a wrap up and explaining them. So here we've got this awesome Blazor browser. So Awesome Blazor is a pretty cool site where they just list out, here's all the new cool stuff in Blazor world. And here's a browser that browses across those. So kind of meta and exciting. So some sample code showing that. So Vaktanji, aka Lupusa, he's got a lot of really cool Blazor demos. And so these are all, there's GitHub, you know, code for them, and then they're in browser. So those are pretty cool. And a lot of like games and just fun stuff. Here's practical Asp Net Core. So there's a sample there. And then finally, one that I always love to point out, this is Blazing Pizza. This is from the Blazor team. And they update it, and it's got some, you know, kind of best practices, and it builds up to a pretty cool application, and it has drone pizza delivery, which is pretty neat. And then finally, Blazor boilerplate also. So a lot of good stuff. So nice to see this kind of write-up listing these all. All right, a couple of neat little browser interop things, pulling new features into Blazor. Here is using your web camera. So this is wrapping the JavaScript. So he uses a JavaScript shim and pulls that in. So he's here's we scroll down a little bit. Here's the JavaScript to do that, and then he just uses interop to call that. So So then once it's all done, he's got a video source, and he's setting the video source. He's got video and a canvas, and so mapping the two together. So there you go. And one other neat one from Jimmy. This is using Bluetooth with Blazor. So here he's showing how to do that, and using JS interop again. And he's got a component and a neat little sample. This is crazy. I don't even know. I'm trying to wrap my head around what exactly I would use Bluetooth wise, but it's pretty neat to see that kind of blurring the lines of what you can do. All right. Congrats to the Peach Pie folks. So Peach Pie is PHP running on .NET Core, and it's pretty cool. And they do answer of course, there's the questions of, but why would you do that? And so they do, kind of reiterate that. I feel like they have to do this every time they get featured on Hacker News or whatever. But there's a lot of really cool stuff here. You get kind of the best of PHP, including the ecosystem, WordPress, and all the other kind of CMS systems that are built on it. But you get the speed, performance, and security of .NET Core, the portability and all that. So a lot of really cool stuff. Back when I was working with .NET Foundation, I helped bring them into .NET Foundation, and so that was really cool too. And then they have beautiful animated animation here showing actually in Visual Studio and getting the all the benefits of editing .NET Core and a PHP application running in Visual Studio with .NET Core. So just magical stuff. So congrats to you folks. All right, here is just a neat little, because we're doing a lot of web dev stuff, here's a neat HTML attribute I had not even realized was a thing. This is the autofill spec. So this is in the HTML specs, you'll see this autocomplete. And I had always wondered why sometimes, especially on my phone, but also just in the browser, some websites will autocomplete things like zip codes or even things like one-time codes, one-time passwords. So there's actually a spec for this, and they use the same also for web or for like Android applications and iPhone apps also. So this is a good thing to know about, including stuff like telephone, all your pretty much all kinds of stuff like new password, current password. Here's the one-time code. So if you're doing a one-time code, phones can actually, when they receive these texts, they know how to understand that and map that in. So I thought this was really cool. So this is in the HTML specs. And then also the Mozilla docs, the MDN, they also kind of go into some detail here about this autofill. So, and again, all this stuff, usernames, passwords, addresses. So help your users out and use these on your forms. Good stuff. Okay, here's a cool one. So Cecil, just a quick tweet here about the tags attribute when you're using Project Tie. So with the tags attribute, you can map specific things in your Tie file, your Tie YAML, and you can say, then you can, when you want to start things up, you can say, just run these ones using these tags. So if you have a large Tie application, you can map and you can selectively start up different things. So I thought that was pretty slick. All right, John Hilton talking about cool features. So Edge in Canary, and I'm not even sure if it's rolled out to dev yet, but there's new features for Edge browser that in the dev tools where you can do some cool like Postman style stuff. So you can edit API requests and you can replay them as well. So this is really nice, especially in applications where you're doing things that have complicated tokens. I'm imagining, Christos and JD, like you run into this stuff with identity things, right? And so these complicated tokens and being able to replay and debug a request is a nice feature. So, and then there's more information in the docs, digging into this, but so really cool feature. This is an experimental feature, so you have to enable it, and it's just in Canary, but absolutely worth running Canary just for that. Docs update from James. So James has been updating the docs for performance recommendations. Best practices for gRPC. So really cool to see that. So lots of updates here: reusing channels, concurrency, keep alive, bidirectional streaming, all the good stuff. And James has also been just asking people on Twitter, like, hey, which docs do you want to see me update? So, let him know. This is the time where, API surfaces are kind of finalizing, all the last minute PRs are getting wrapped up for .NET 5, and people are now moving to updating all the docs. So there you go. And the last one I have to share is just the blog post here on Asp Net Core updates. .NET 5 Preview 8. This includes a lot of stuff that we've had on the show recently. So things like Blazor, we have CSS isolation, lazy loading. That was all on the Blazor show we did recently. A lot of Blazor stuff. Some cool stuff like model binding with C#9 record types, which is pretty slick. Auto refresh with .NET Watch. I know people have been wanting that for a long time. But one that really caught my attention, I said, I gotta ring up Christos and find out what's going on. What is the deal with Microsoft.Identity.Web? And I think with that, I will just pass on over to you folks.
Nice. Well, thanks for having us. And we're delighted to talk about identity, right? In any form or manner. In fact, as you were talking about James New King doing the gRPC stuff, I have in the oven a blog post about doing gRPC with the latest Untitled.Web library that we're going to be talking about. So authenticating your gRPC services and being able to call Graph or other downstream APIs super efficiently. So you have a front end, maybe a console app or a web app calling into a gRPC service super efficiently, super fast, and then authenticating and passing the tokens back to another API. So that's exciting, right? We're testing the frontier of what's coming out there in this role. So it's great.
I love that when product teams at Microsoft are pushing the edge and writing the apps and running into the bugs, and like as part of that, writing the blog posts and the docs and everything.
That's the plan, right? So the blog post is going out there, and then docs are following suit, and then we have samples as well going up. So if you want to work with any of these services, you should be able to find everything from a video to a blog to docs and be able to do it right. And cool. I am going to let JP drive the deck that we have today, because I know that it's his baby and he loves it. So
all right, well, I have to, right before I pass over to that, I just glanced over at the chat, and I just have to give a shout out. We have people all over the world. It's just so much fun. We have people, Greece, San Martin, Brazil. I mean, we had somebody in India. We have Vietnam. We had Algeria earlier. It's just really exciting to connect with the developer community all around the world. So
yes,
thank you for watching, including, I don't even know, middle of the night, whatever time it is. So South Africa, Maldives. I mean, you people are awesome. Thank you.
Hey, shout out to my Greek buddies out there.
All right. Well, I guess I'll add your slides up here.
Microsoft, what happened?
All right.
Refresh. Let's refresh this one. And before we start talking about identity, a quick introduction. Me and JP work as developer advocates for the Microsoft Identity team. We're PMs. And we deal with identity of all forms and manner, B2C, Azure AD, B2B, and what have you. And our goal is to come out and educate you guys. So we stream as well at the 425 show every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 a.m. Pacific time, 10 a.m. Eastern time. So if you want to see how we build stuff with .NET, Flutter, Xamarin, Go, Ruby, Python, we do everything. And that's the whole point. And you can come to our stream as well. If you want to come and talk about the awesome stuff that you build, let us know.
And I'll add the link to that in the show notes.
Awesome. JP, you're good to go, my friend.
All right, cool. So good morning, afternoon, evening. Hey, John, is there any way to share my screen? I queued it
Oh,
up.
yeah.
I don't know if you can get to it or not, but
There we go.
I put animations in here because I know
Oh, yeah,
nobody
we
likes
gotta have
slides. I know nobody wants to look at slides, and so we thought, well, if we have to do a couple, we'll just do a couple and make sure that they're pretty entertaining. So, we're going to talk about Identity.Web today. These two are what we feel are, this is what we feel our customers talk about when they're in the subway together with their friends as they discuss new libraries. I've gotten kind of weary of having to use corporate decks, and so I thought, well, we should at least try to have fun with it. So, really quick, we're going to talk about what an identity provider is, just to sort of level set in case anyone's not familiar. And of course, we talk about these for 6 hours a week live. So we just want to make sure we're not leaving anybody behind on what that means. And then we're going to talk about sort of how it fits, because we know authentication in Asp Net Core has been I don't think constant churn is the nicest way to put it, but that's sort of what it's been. Is there's always something different, right?
Yeah, personally, I mean, I've given talks and I've helped with docs and reviewing. We're working on docs now on how to update to the latest Asp Net Core, and including people moving from like web forms or MVC, and that's one of the hardest parts, right? Is like, how do you update your identity stuff? Because Yep.
For sure. Well, and we've got old projects that we open, and it's like, we haven't touched it in 2 or 3 months, and suddenly all of the identity stuff is totally different, right? And so there's a really concerted effort to clean that up and make that a really good experience for anybody who's building in .NET and using Azure AD and the rest of the identity platform. So we'll talk about sort of how it fits in with all these other pieces, and then Christos is going to show you how to do it in a new project, because some of those new templates are going to be available. And then I'm going to show you how to do it in an old project. And when I say old, I mean maybe 3 or 4 months old. It's still .NET Core. But the way you had to do it, a few months ago is different from the way you have to do it today, or at least what you can do. But I think it'll be really good, because it's quite it's quite an interesting experience. So, of course, the first thing is storing your own user passwords.
Oh, yeah.
You can do it if you want. We don't want you to do it. I'd say there are probably a lot of different reasons why you shouldn't do it. Many of those are on the screen right now. But the biggest thing, of course, is that when you have your own password database, now you have a lot of people who are going to come after you, right? Because that's some of the most sensitive data. And, of course, we know what people do, which is summer 2020 is terrible, ! Is the password that they use. And they use that everywhere. They use it at work. They use it at their bank. They use it at their dog walking service. They use it for everything that they've got. And so we don't want developers to have to deal with that. Like, that's not something I'd ever want to take on. Like 10 years ago was when I built my first app in Azure that was for the public, right? And back then we had something called Azure Access Control Services, which was sort of an extremely simplified version of Azure AD as we know it today. And I sort of instantly fell in love with it. I don't have to deal with this on my own. I can let somebody use a password they already have, and I can let somebody else or some other group of people, like the Azure AD team, for example, they can build a reliable identity service that's ultra secure and has lots of people watching it and keeping an eye on it. And I, as a developer who just needs to get an app out, right? I don't need to be an identity pro. I just want to get work done. I can go use that service, and that's key. Is you don't need to be an identity pro in order to use our stuff. And what we're going to see with Identity.Web is we get a whole lot closer to preventing you from having to have really, really deep identity knowledge to get there, right? So this group of people, Marsha's up here and she's showing a Power BI dashboard of all the code they managed to delete. We're going to see a lot of that later today, is how much code we're able to delete with Identity.Web. But again, it's all about being identity for everybody, right? So it's not just for people who are like really focused on identity, like Christos and I are, and it's not for people who want to do all that, right? There's so much knowledge of tokens and protocols and all these different things, and you end up in this place where you've got this really esoteric vocabulary, and lots of different people talk about corners of different things identity related, and it just ends up being really confusing and complex. And when integrating identity is the 15th item on your 200 item punchdown list, you don't really care. You just want to get it done, right? And so if we look at what we had sort of today, right, or yesterday, we've got two different libraries, two main different libraries. There's Asp Net Core Authentication, and that's the thing that we use for getting a user signed into an app, right? So that's the OpenID Connect middleware and the cookie middleware, all the stuff you have to configure to get a user signed in. But then when you want to access an API like the graph or an API that you built on your own, well, now suddenly you've got to go do MSAL or ADAL, which was the older version. You've got to go do that on your own. And that's not very fun because those two experiences are pretty different, right? So you've got to know when to hook into different things. And, oh, this event happens in OpenID Connect, which what does OpenID Connect? What does that even mean? I don't know because I just want my app to work. I've got to go hook into an event and send some tokens over here and make these calls over here. And it's super complex and annoying, especially if it's not your thing.
Yeah.
Was that go ahead.
I felt like I learned at points in time, like OpenID. And then I was like, okay, fine, I got to learn OAuth. And I learned that. And then there's OpenID Connect. And then there's versions of the specs. And like you said, it's a bad thing to even if you, I don't know, like you've got to keep up with it. And then there's security issues. And it's like, I want to trust somebody else who's going to.
Yeah, exactly. And so do I, right? Like, I don't want to write identity code all day. And we hear these stories of these mythical identity developers at big companies like Walmart's and the Coca-Colas of the world, these huge megacorps. And I'll be honest, I've really never met that many of them. I've met a lot of people who need to develop with identity solutions. They need to design identity into a solution. But with the exception of us, with Christos and I and the rest of our team, I don't really know that many people who would self-identify as, oh yeah, I'm an identity developer. I totally do this all day, right? And so we want to make that experience as simple as possible. So if you were doing it sort of today, if you were to go crank up a new project today in NetCore 3 or 3.1, you'd have to configure Asp Net authentication on the one side to get your user signed in, and then you'd have to configure MSAL in addition to that. And then those two things sort of play together so that later on in your app, you can make a protected request to an API or to the graph or something like that you can go request a token with MSAL and then go and make this HTTP call. Identity.Web aims to simplify all that. So instead of having these two different experiences, these two APIs that you have to learn, instead, you have one API that you need to learn, which is the Identity.Web surface. And 95% of the work that we had to do before, Identity.Web does for you. So there's a whole collection of tasteful defaults, and then you can sort of eject and go do something on your own if you need more complex scenarios. So we can get you started and get the flywheel going really quickly. But if you need to step to the side because you have a specific requirement or because there's something that some part of the identity experience that you need to tweak or manage on your own, there are lots of ejection points to be able to do that. So if we look at sort of the relationship between all of these, on the top level, these are all the individual pieces that you need to make this work. OpenID Connect authentication, cookie authentication, JWT bearer if you're using APIs. You need views and an account controller just to initiate an authentication, right? A lot of that's abstracted behind the Azure AD.UI libraries that we have today, but it's still separate from MSAL. And so at the very bottom, now we have Identity.Web and Identity.Web.
So you said MSAL a few times, and I think you identified earlier, but can you explain that?
Oh, sure. It's a Microsoft Authentication library. It is the primary mechanism or primary library for getting tokens from Azure AD.
Okay.
So if you need an access token to talk to an API like one of our own, like Graph or Azure Management APIs, or if you need a token to talk to your own APIs that have been configured to be protected with Azure AD, you need to use MSAL to get a token.
Cool.
So that's our primary token acquisition sort of mechanism, but it was wholly independent of how you signed into an app, because those two activities are kind of different. One of them is I need to sign into a specific application, but then that specific application may make a call to another API, to the graph or to a downstream API that supports your app. And that would require using MSAL to go and get a token to go talk to that app.
And so you mentioned Azure, but that's not because it's also working with, it's just token acquisition. So that would also work with other things that follow those specifications, right? Okay.
Right. Anything that use, and MSAL is really geared towards our identity platform. That's not to say that you couldn't make it work with a generic OAuth 2 or OpenID Connect endpoint, but most of the semantics of the library and most of the expectations are that you're using it to talk to the Microsoft identity platform. So Azure AD, Azure AD B2C, or Microsoft accounts, like your consumer account you use for your Xbox or Outlook.com personal account, those sorts of things.
Cool.
So now our new thing is Identity.Web, which does all of the work of all these boxes, of configuring all these different boxes and getting everything where it needs to go. All of that's done by Identity.Web. So you don't have to do it. You don't need to know what all of these different things are. You just need to configure Identity.Web appropriately, and all of these other things light up.
All right. Now, how much would you pay?
Solid for you, man.
That does sound good.
Yeah. So, and we're going to look at some codes. We don't need to spend too much time here, but in particular, specifically, the getting tokens experience is infinitely better, I think, than what you've got today, where you've got these two really distinct activities that you have to do. This middle one here of getting tokens and calling APIs, I think that's one where you'll see sort of the most optimization to a developer's workflow. So Christos is going to walk you through. I wish we'd have known about it earlier. We would have come back here 2 weeks ago. But Christos is going to show you what it's like using this with a new app, right? With the new, because some of this is built into the new templates, right?
Correct. Although I'm not using the templates today, I'm just going to go through maybe the iterations of having a non-authenticated app, and with that, maybe I'll start sharing now, so we can switch to my screen, and we can just walk through the code. So sharing now. There you go. So this is a file new project in .NET Core. So,
long-time viewers of the show will know that one of my main jobs on this show is bump up your font size. That's all.
I was just about to beat you to that, but you beat me anyway.
There you go.
So this is, thank you, John. Thank you for being there to keep me straight. This is a file new project. This is .NET new Asp Net Razer Pages, right? And this is what comes out of that. So we don't have any authentication here to work with. And our goal is to maybe add authentication. So we started a project, or we have a brand new project. We want to add authentication. You could use the templates inside Visual Studio and the CLI. In fact, they were just added to the RC. So if you're using the preview versions of Visual Studio, you should be able to get in and start playing with. And the whole point is to eventually make them available as the mainstream product. So in the future, when you do file new project with auth inside Visual Studio or with the .NET Core CLI, and not the authentication bits, you will not get the older identity libraries. You will get the Microsoft.Identity.Web out of the box. So if I were to add authentication here, let me quickly switch tags. So it's playing with tags. I don't know if anybody else likes this way, but I write my code and then I tag it. So if I change now, what we did here, let me, that did not add the appropriate stuff. Anyway, we can fix it. It's fine. So here you'll notice that first of all, we need to bring the appropriate library, and this is the old one. So 3.1, and then here 3.1. You need 2 packages for ASP.NET front end stuff. So let's save this one. Hopefully VS Code will prompt us for a restore. If it doesn't prompt us, we can do a .NET restore. I didn't save myself any time here. So if we go back into the startup, you see that it says this is the old API. So the command to add authentication to our page is just that, add Microsoft Identity Web App Authentication. In our configuration, we have an Azure AD section that points to our tenant. And then we have an app already registered for us. So you just go and create an app registration in Azure AD. You pull the information like the domain, the tenant ID, and the client ID. The instance remains the same. And then in our code, in our startup, all we have to do is just say add Microsoft.Identity.Web authentication. In our controllers also, we need to add the UI elements for this. And then in our controllers, we have in the views, under shared, there's a login partial. So the one difference here is that now the area is Microsoft.Identity. I think in the past was Azure AD, and then everything else remains the same. And in one of our controllers, what I've done here is in our controller, I have unauthenticated access to index, and then I require people to authorize when they hit the privacy page. So if we were to run this one, again, one-liner, right? I did not have to add any complex stuff into the code. If we run this one, oh my God, this is...
So that's a nice thing. Like if I'm updating an existing application, this doesn't look like it affects my code too much to change over to it.
Correct. Did I?
Because that's always, we were talking about that a bit earlier, but that's always been part of the pain, is not just that it seems like every update to Asp Net Core is a new thing I've got to learn, but also updating previous code. It's like, oh no. And if I've got data in a database, it's even worse.
Correct.
Tokens, all that, yeah.
If I run this one now, hopefully I did in the right tag. Did I save this one? I haven't saved this one. So, ooh. I think my...
Well, while you're doing that, we got a question maybe JP can answer.
Sure.
Asking if a version of this is available for native mobile or Xamarin.
No.
Okay.
Not yet. Can't make any promises, but it's certainly certainly something to keep an eye out for.
Okay.
And interesting. You know what? I will do a file new project. So got a new web pages.
Did you have templates already for it? Because I saw we saw they're going to be Identity.Web's going to be there in the.
I haven't updated my. Yeah, I haven't updated mine, so I don't know if that's gonna happen since yesterday. So I'm gonna go with web app.
Got another question here. For API projects, is this similar?
It is. So in API projects, there are really two main considerations. One is I need to validate tokens that are incoming, right? So I need to check the token signature is valid and make sure it's got the correct scopes and that it's got the correct audience, all of the things that go into making a token, quote, valid, right? So it's essentially the same one-liner. In fact, when Christos was typing that, it says add Microsoft.Identity.Web app authentication. The other one is the same, except for instead of web app, it's web API authentication. So if your VS Code is too zoomed in, for example, you won't see that there's a difference between API and app, and you'll put the wrong one in there. So there's that side, but then there's also the side of an API that needs to make an API call itself, which is what typically called the on behalf of flow, where my client app, a mobile app or web app, has called into an API, and then that API needs to go as me to another API. And that scenario is also supported in Identity.Web. So if you're an API developer, you can both validate your tokens and make and do token acquisition to get tokens for downstream calls with the same library.
And
correct.
To make sure I understand, but also because there's somebody's frustrated that it's not available for Xamarin, but this is Microsoft.Identity.Web. This is a web flow for authentication, right? And there are other building blocks that you kind of build on top of, like MSAL and those other things that you can use from other applications.
That's right. So yeah, so from Xamarin, for example, there's MSAL, because largely in Xamarin, if I'm sitting in front of a mobile device or even a bigger device, MSAL handles signing the user in and getting tokens for them, just by virtue of the fact that it's a little bit different when you're in front of a web app versus when you're in front of a mobile app or a desktop app. Mm-hmm. And so MSAL does handle sign-in for you there, in addition to acquiring tokens. So MSAL and .NET for web apps is a little bit different because it doesn't typically sign in a user, but it does help you get tokens. Whereas MSAL.NET for Xamarin and desktop does also do sign-in. So it'll open a browser window and you sign in, and then tokens get sent back, and you're signed in, and then you can make calls. Yep. In fact, we just spent 3 hours doing that with
nice.
Christos just did that with Xamarin and B2C.
That's right. Yeah, on your stream you're doing with Xamarin.
Yep.
One other question is, how does this support identity server, or is there any kind of interaction with that? Because there have been some identity server based templates in Asp Net Core in the past.
So this library is geared towards using our endpoints for Azure AD and Identity and Microsoft Identity Platform. Most of what we do is standards based. So all of the Azure AD and Microsoft Identity endpoints are standards based. So it's possible it might work, especially if you change the authorities. But there are probably some specifics around our implementation that would cause it to break. So I would say it's absolutely not a supported path, but it might work.
Okay. And then one other question here is, release timeframe and also .NET Core support. Does this work with .NET Core 3, or is this for .NET 5 preview, or what's it for?
It does .NET Core 3.1 and up.
Okay, cool.
So 3.1 and up.
Yep. So the templates will be available in Visual Studio relatively soon. I think they're coming in as part of .NET 5, but there are preview templates already out today, and the library itself has been out for a little while too. So it's all available today, and we're looking for GA relatively soon too, before the end of the year.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, you got it working, Christos? Over there? Have we made it?
I think so. So that's the problem. Yeah. So. I'm gonna close this one. So cancel. I just wanted to show that for a file new project, if you were to do it, you add the appropriate package references, and then in the startup, you come here, you add the appropriate Microsoft.Identity.Web, and then in here you add the configuration for signing in, and add authentication down here, as well as the use authentication here, and that's work, but. I don't want to run this one. I want to go back into my proper demo. So apologies for jumping back and forth, but don't want to save this one, and I want to jump back into this one. So
I would want to another question here. Can we customize the things like the "You have been signed out" page?
Yes, you can. They're built inside the DLL for Microsoft.Identity.Web, but there's a way for you to customize the specific pages if you want to.
Now in previous Asp Net Core Identity, it was included in the NuGet package, but if I could scaffold it and I could create a view using the right name, and it would override it if it's found. So you're using the same mechanism there?
I think so. In the docs, there's information about how to go and override it. So this is a working solution here. So the home page is not authenticated. And then if I go into my privacy page, it will redirect me to the auth endpoint. I have my custom tenant. So let me just grab my password. Super long, super secure. And then paste this one here. And sign in. In fact, it will also prompt me for my two-factor authentication, which is great. I didn't have to worry about doing that separately and spinning up services to do all that.
That is
Azure AD does it for me.
That's just a checkbox, right?
Yes, it is.
That is a really nice thing.
And there you have it. So it pulled my information from the Azure AD. It put it there. In fact, it populates the context.identity.user, and all the information is available to us. And I just wanted to quickly switch into the API configuration, because people may have questions about that as well. So in this specific sample I have in front of me, again, you'll notice that we have the package. We don't need to include UI because we are working with APIs. And then inside my startup.cs, you'll notice I have, let me close this one. And let me zoom in a little bit on this one, because I want people to know that if you, let's close this one as well. So now, if I did not want to do anything else, if we didn't have anything else to call into, then in order for my API to validate incoming requests, this is the middleware that we need to configure. And then in the controllers, if I go into my weather forecast, I have an authorize attribute. People that have worked with identity will probably identify this one, or authorization. We have a scope. And inside my get, I'm only doing one call. Check this out. With one line, I can verify if my user has already the accepted scopes, and then I can move on to either accept or drop the request if the appropriate scopes have not been requested for my APIs. So I don't have to create like 20 lines of code to do that. Everything is out of the box. And now, if I wanted my API to call another API, then I have to do this one. Say enable token acquisition to call downstream API. And in that case, we also need to add some token caches. So you'll notice that there are some options there for token cache. You can roll your own. Anything, in fact, that derives from an I distributed token cache is available and fair game. So if I do IntelliSense is not playing game with me today. Oh, come on. Distributed. I think, what is it? Omnisphere.
Restored?
No, it should be restored. Because
Do you still have a semicolon at the end of line 23?
Oh, do I have a some?
I think so, maybe.
Damn you, JP.
I mean, look, I get it. You've been working and typing all morning long. So
Yeah.
Although token cache provide enable token cache acquisition for downstream. We already have that. I think it's something wrong with OmniServe. But anyway, you can have add distributed token caches. I think you can add session token caches.
Yeah, so if you've already configured a distributed cache in ASP.NET, you can make that available to MSAL to be used.
And something that is new as well is add Microsoft Graph, which allows you to call into Graph. I don't know if you need to pass.
That was a specific question that just got asked. So in the past, I tried to use Microsoft Graph with MSAL, and I gave myself a headache. I mean, there was a lot of tokens and confusing things I didn't understand, and I felt like I was having to learn about specs. And like you were saying earlier, JP, I don't care. I just want my app to work. You know?
Exactly.
Yep.
I actually was scared to deploy the app because I didn't know if I was doing it right. So that is handled then in this case, like to work with Microsoft Graph as well?
Exactly. And that's a fairly new addition. It wasn't even part of the previous API version that I was working with. So as we're nearing the GA, you'll see that all these things are settling down, and these teams are working very closely with each other to make sure that we enable API token acquisition and making it very, very easy. So here you are with Add Microsoft Graph. You get the appropriate tokens. You have everything you need. So if you have a graph client further down the line inside one of your controllers, you just pass the token and you're good to go.
So for people that don't know, what does that enable? Microsoft Graph then allows me to interact with other things that user has access to, right? Like
or your enterprise, right? So you can access SharePoint, you can access OneDrive, you can programmatically reach out. In fact, the app that we were building on the previous stream was about pulling the people that you frequently work with through the Graph API and then being able to interact with them through your mobile app, right? So, and that's a single call to people API, which is great.
Cool.
If you want to send emails, for example, we see a lot of people moving code from SMTP client to Graph to send emails out because they want it to come from their domain and it's in Office 365 or whatever. And that's a fast way to do it.
And that's exactly the use case I used it for, was inviting people to a domain and sending invite emails and managing those user emails. And in the case that I did, I wrote a bunch of PowerShell, and then ended up building it into an app. And so this is beautiful. It makes me happy to see this.
And I think what you'll find even more beautiful is what JP is going to do next. I'm going to stop sharing, and while JP is setting up, I don't know if we already mentioned that since I was so focused on my code, but ADAL, which was the previous version of our library to communicate with Azure AD and B2C, is actually going away. We announced the sunsetting of the library as of June this year, and you have 2 years to migrate. So if you are building brand new apps, we definitely want you to start using MSAL. If you have existing web apps, then you can also take your older authentication and move it to the latest Untitled.Web if you are using Asp Net Core. And we've done quite a few migrations as well in our stream and our blogs. So we want people to be aware that MSAL is going to be the new de facto, and then ADAL is going to be away. So we give you 2 years to migrate. And JP is going to show you how you take a legacy app, if you want to call it legacy app, 4 or 5 months ago, and migrate it into the new Untitled.Web.
Yeah. So this is a pretty gnarly app, I guess. It really shouldn't be, but it is. Just
first I have to ask, which theme is this? I like it.
This is Outrun Electric. So,
nice.
I was a child of the '80s. I remember playing Outrun in the arcade, which was a place where they had video games that were not at your house that you went and put coins in to play. Just for anyone who's not familiar. And I used to love it, and it was so much fun. And then I found this, and I thought, oh, it's actually not too bad on my eyes. It might be hard to, I hope it's not hard to see here because I've been using it for like the past month on stream, but we'll get zoomed in a little bit and and take a look. So this isn't older. When I say older, I mean, it maybe 9 months ago, 10 months ago. It's not super, super old. And it goes through the different ways that you have to configure Azure AD and MSAL. And if you wanted to use Azure AD authentication, you may end up with code similar to this if you used it just the other day. And so in our services, the first thing we have to do is add OpenID Connect. And OpenID Connect is the protocol that underpins most of the sort of modern authentication. It's sort of like an extension of OAuth 2 to also include user data. So if you used OAuth 2 in the past, primarily it was intended for you to access somebody else's resources. So to access a user's photos on Facebook, for example.
Like I used it for Twitter, right? Like to be able to. Yep. So it was for access to APIs. It wasn't really intended for authentication, but people used it. I mean, it wasn't intended for like third-party authentication to my site, but people used it that way.
Yep.
Okay.
So OpenID Connect, the whole point of that was to sort of bolt on some stuff to OAuth 2 to make that like a proper use case of, oh, you want to authenticate a user? Cool. We're going to send you an ID token, which has a bunch of data about the user, in addition to any sort of access tokens you might use to connect to their Twitter account and send a tweet. And to have access to do things, we're going to also send you this blob of data about that user. And that's what underpins all of Azure AD. So Azure AD uses OpenID Connect as its primary mechanism for integration with your app. And if you had to configure it on your own, this is the kind of code that you needed. So you had to go and configure the OpenID Connect endpoint or a middleware in order with all of the different pieces of information. And if you're not an identity pro and you're not someone who's doing identity work on a regular basis, most of this is probably moon language, because what's an authority? I don't know. Me, I'm authority of myself, right? My mother, the cops. I don't know. What's the authority, right? So there are all these extra pieces of code that you had to write. And this was just to configure it at the base. When you said, oh, I want to call the graph too, then we get down into the configuration, which is when we go and start using MSAL again. So in here, this whole blob of code is to take MSAL, or to let MSAL take what we call an authorization code to go back to Azure AD and say, give me an access token. So this is all the protocol detail leaking out that you have to understand in order to code against it correctly, right?
Yeah. Or in my case, copy and paste from Stack Overflow until it seemed to work. But
That's right.
I didn't know if I'm making tokens or whatever, right?
Well, that's the thing, is it is so sort of just completely weird and foreign that you end up with a lot of copy and paste code, and you end up with finding samples, and some of the samples are out of date, or they're not covering certain parts of the experience that you need to be worried about. And then you end up putting things at risk because maybe your app has a hole that you're not expecting, or a token's not being validated correctly, and there's a whole lot of risk that goes along with it. So we have all this code here. This handles the second leg of the authorization code flow, which is one of the OAuth protocols, and it lets MSAL finally get a token for me to go and call graph. So all of this code here can be replaced.
So this is the old code, and we're updating to get to. So this goes away.
Yeah. So this is the new code. So this is the new code, which is this one line, which is 34. And you'll notice that everything from 36 all the way down through to 114 has been nuked. All right. We don't need it anymore. It's gone.
Yes.
So the fact that we can delete this code and that my app will still work and sign us in, which I'll run it, just somewhat of a morbid curiosity, but this should be all that we have to make changes for. So I'm going to run this app, and this should get me signed in with my side account. So let's see what happens. We'll go to localhost 5001, and I'm signed in. Look at that.
Whoa.
Yep. So there are all the claims that I had. Now I'll do it in a private window just so nobody thinks I'm
cheating.
Just this is a cooking show where we pre-baked it all. And look at us, it came out of the oven, So I tried to go to the app, right? Localhost 5001, and I get automatically redirected over here to sign in. So I'll sign in to my Azure AD tenant, and I'll put in my password, and I'll get a multi-factor thing on my phone, which of course we don't have to code against any of that. All that's sort of done automatically, which is super cool. So I get that. It looks at my face and it says, hey, do you want to stay signed in? Sure, why not? And then we're signed in. Now I'm signed into the app. So we managed to replace a ton of code with a one-liner, which is super awesome, right? And to go back to the question earlier about the UI, the reason is because you'll notice in here, I don't have any of those UI packages. In fact, it's not even included in here. So that Microsoft.Identity.Web UI package, it's not even here because I didn't need it for my specific app because I was handling it on my own. So what those UI packages do is they essentially add like a challenge method, which is when somebody's unauthenticated, you do what's called a challenge, and that challenge is what redirects them over to Azure AD or wherever, right? And so those UI packages handle both the pages that send you somewhere, like send you over to Azure AD, and then also the pages that will receive it when it comes back. But they're not required. So if you wanted to build your own pages, you end up doing something like essentially something like a like you have an authentication provider, and then it's a sign in async or challenge async, and you put this into one of your controller methods. So if you had your own sign-in page or whatever, and then it would handle it for you. The other way to do it, which is, in my opinion, even easier, is to use authentication policies or authorization policies in Asp Net Core. So that's just part of Asp Net, are these authorization policies. And in here, when we go look at a controller, let's look at this controller. So this controller has an anonymous page, but then it also has these two schemes. So this scheme is for Azure AD, and this scheme is for Azure AD B2C. You could have 25 of these schemes if you wanted. One for Twitter, one for Facebook, one for your corporate, whatever. By using these schemes, when we have this authorized tag on here, the authorized attribute for a specific scheme will send a user down that specific scheme, right? So I've only got one registered. I've only got Azure AD registered here in Startup, which is what's happening with this. But if we wanted to add 5 other identity systems here, we could add each one of them and give them a specific name. So add Microsoft Identity Web App Authentication, and you'll notice one of the overloads here is config section name. So I'll send it in the configuration, and I'll call this one, B to C.
Hey, John, can you quickly show your configuration? Somebody's asking. I wonder how it looks like.
Oh, sure.
In terms of.
Yeah, I can show my configuration. I'll just have to go
Then
roll some secrets afterward, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So here. Please don't use my secrets against me until I'm off of this call. But this is what app settings.json looks like. Pretty straightforward. In fact, I'm going to delete this one, even though I guess you could rewind it and go back. It's like the Streisand effect. By deleting it, I'm calling attention to it, and everybody's going to go find it. So the configuration, a lot of this, if you go through Visual Studio and use the Visual Studio templates, a lot of this is already generated for you.
Yeah.
But instance will almost always be this, unless you're using a sovereign cloud like Azure China or Azure Government. Your domain is your Azure AD tenant name or domain name, right? So this is in the Azure AD portal. You can also use a custom domain. So if you've already got one, you can just use a custom one. You don't have to remember your current one. You can use whichever one you want. Your tenant ID is your ID of your specific tenant. So very similar to this, only it's the GUID representation of your tenant. Maybe not representation, that's not the right word. There's no translation between a string and a GUID here. But and then your client ID, this is also known as your application ID. So when you go through the process of registering an app, which is all sort of outlined in the docs, you'll get a client ID, you'll get a client secret, and then these callback path and redirect URIs, these are both used for both where's the user going to come back, and then which redirect URI have you registered in your application. So if you go through the doc that says this is how you register an app in Azure AD, you will have pretty much every piece of information that you need to build this configuration block.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yep. And that's it. And so our app is done, right? So now we've got our app, and we've eliminated 134 lines of code, and it's a lot easier to maintain, and it keeps up to date with the latest standards. So one of the big changes we've seen recently is there's now something called authorization code with PKCE or PKCE, public key proof key code exchange, which is a protocol detail that nobody actually needs to care about. And the thing is, this uses that, but you don't need to know anything about it. You don't have to deal with it. And so as the standards change and as the protocols change, we make sure the libraries are kept up to date to map to those. But your code doesn't need to change, because there's nothing in here about PKCE or auth codes or any sort of specific flows. Everything in here is just about, what do I need to do? Well, I need to add authentication to my app.
So then you also hopefully handle like the database migration sort of stuff too.
Wait, you're breaking up. I think the batteries are good.
Well, because as I update right between versions, I worry about my database schema and all that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah. Luckily, this is one thing you don't have to add to that list of worries, right? Once you've migrated it over, of course, we'll announce any breaking changes to the library, but largely these abstractions are so high level that unless you're really changing a whole lot of the custom configuration parts, this code should work sort of in an ongoing manner without a whole lot of changes. So.
And so like what I'm hearing from this, and also like learned from previous pain from doing things the wrong way, I don't want to customize and extend. I want to use the things that are provided for me, like using the policies, using the claims, using the built-in stuff as much as possible, and let you worry. As long as I'm keeping with the standards, hopefully that stuff moves smoothly. Yep. Versus in the past, what we've tried, people like myself have made the mistake of, I'll just add this into the database as another column, and I'll, like build on top, and then now I'm in a world of pain, right? So,
So, cool. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, there's a decent amount of question. One question that's come up is like, both of you have shown some sample code. I included a link in the chat to the docs. So GitHub, Azure AD, Microsoft.Identity.Web, and then there's some samples and stuff linked from there, right?
Yep.
Okay. And we also have sorry.
I was getting that link, but this wiki has at least until it gets into the main docs, this wiki is the sort of authority for how to use the library for now.
So this is in progress docs, kind of like these are, and then these docs will go over to docs.microsoft.com eventually.
Exactly. Yeah, we're also working with the docs teams to bring quite a few of the samples that we have done into the official documentation, like Blazor WASM, gRPC, a lot of cutting edge stuff that people are not aware of. But once this GAs, which is going to be very, very soon, all the docs should be found in the official docs space.
Yep.
Very cool. I'm looking through the chat. Christos, you've been answering questions like a madman during this. I don't know. Are there any here that jump out to you as something you'd like to highlight?
There are. I think there's a persistent theme here about being able to use the Identity.Web library with custom IDPs, whether that's an identity server or your own database or something else. And I think we tried to answer that a few times, but the point is that this library is designed to work with Azure AD in B2C and not other providers. I think the plan was to make it as an abstraction to be able to work with other things, but our goal here is to provide best practices and guide people to have a delegated authentication instead of managing their own users and databases, right? You want to leave that to somebody else and you focus on getting the tokens and moving on.
And then, like, so there was also the identity server came up, and then I'm, kind of aware there's other things like there's Okta and Auth0 and some of these other, things. Is the idea potentially that this would integrate with that as well, or at least be an abstraction that they could work with?
That's an interesting point, because one of the big things is the identity team sort of took over building this library because it was, of course, we have a vested interest in people using our identity platform, want to make it easier for developers. So the difference was, of course, that a lot of the underlying components are maintained by Asp Net Core. So I have not heard of any plans to make this a sort of common abstraction for Asp Net Core where anybody could use this with any type of provider, because I think a lot of that is already there to some degree. It's more complex to set up, and it's closer to a tray of parts as opposed to a nearly assembled puzzle. But I believe the intention for this library is for it to be open source anyway, and be out there and available. So at least as far as looking at the patterns, or maybe even submitting that as an idea, I certainly think the team would be open to either considering it or at least discussing why it is the way it is today.
Yeah.
So sorry, go on, John.
Well, and like you've mentioned, you're building on top of, like, you're making a nice experience for Azure AD, but this Azure AD is built with OpenID Connect, and you're working with the protocols and stuff. So hopefully, from that layer just of working with the same protocols, that's the interaction seems.
Yeah, and we also want to establish that it's also for B2C, right? So you don't have to have an enterprise app. You don't have to have a line of business application. You create a web app that you want to authenticate some users. This is the library for you as well if you want to manage users with B2C. And it's transparent. You don't have to download any extra package or whatever. It's the same kind of experience. There's a question about whether you can use this library offline, right? So I think Blazor.ca says, my question was more about how to turn off Azure AD so I can develop the application without online access. Well, how are you going to let your users log in? I mean, if it's a line of business app, then you might as well just use Kerberos or whatever internally to authenticate users. But if you are out on the web, if you need to authenticate users, then from my perspective, even for internal apps, I've used Azure AD before to authenticate, because your IT team will probably be managing everything. Develop and debug locally. Well, I don't think you can debug against Azure AD locally unless you have an emulator for some services. Azure AD is not one of them.
Yeah, we see some customers, they may have like an alternate authentication path, for example, for local dev or for under certain URLs. So it'll use Azure AD normally, and then in certain conditions, you might switch and use a different, and you drive that with the authentication schemes to say use scheme A for Azure AD and use scheme B under the, for these other conditions or specific controllers, whatever.
Authentication or whatever. Yeah.
And that's also helpful for testing. So if you're doing like automated web testing and using something like Selenium or whatever, then those, I think newer versions can go through OAuth flows, but it's kind of a pain. And so it's easier just to use a super long static key or some other kind of alternate authentication. So looking at doing different schemes for different scenarios may be the best place to start for that. We see a lot of customers who they want to migrate from like an existing on-prem database or an HR system or whatever. And so that's when we look at stuff like B2C, because we have lots of different ways to sort of replace a password database with B2C. Of course, both of those require you to be online. But at the same time, unless you're running a database locally or you're running a DC locally, Kerberos is going to require you to be online, and so is a database to some degree, right? So, but yeah, the local dev experience, I completely understand the ask of what do we do about it, but I don't think we have a really good solution just yet.
Well, that brings up another question, which is, as people we've got, we've had 300 people watching. We've all these people are learning about it. They're reading about it. It's now, if they start trying it out and have questions or feedback, where's the best place? Should they file issues on the repo that you link to, or?
Issues for Identity.Web for sure. Of course, they can also. Christos and I are fairly active on Twitter. Christos is a Twitter darling. I'm not nearly as good at Twitter as he is.
Well, and you have that 425 show as well, right? So
that's correct. Right. Yep. And we've got email address you can send, which we'll make sure and share out for, we've even got an 800 number, which we're not ready to share, but that'll be out soon. You can dial an 800 number and get to us and get your identity questions answered. So. Yep.
Cool. Wow. A lot of great information here. I'm really excited. I love my favorite demo was the one where you delete 100 lines of code and code that looked frighteningly familiar to what I'd written and had no idea what I was writing. So this looks really great. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. We shared where people can go to find you and keep up to date. I guess just to clarify then, as far as remind people, what's the kind of next steps? When is the roadmap and shipping kind of stuff?
We're right now made into the templates, and the roadmap is, I think it's aligned with .NET 5, but don't quote me on that. There might be plans for the library to GA sooner, so people can start testing it and using it. I think on the actual repo, there might be a roadmap section where people can go and have a look. But we'll definitely have the Microsoft.Identity.Web team coming on our show on the 25th of September to talk to us about maybe roadmap or cover additional information if you want to ask some more in-depth stuff, like things of, can I use Identity Server with this? Can we make it happen? And what have you. So make sure to tune in on the 25th on our show to come and, link to our stream. Yes, it's the 425 show on Twitch.
If you can drop that in, and I'll make sure I'll add that to the show notes and stuff. Now, let me see there it is.
The 425 show is banned from being able to put.
There it is. Okay.
Thanks. There you go. You have it.
Awesome. Wow. Well, this was great. I am great fun, great information, and I'm really happy to simplify my code and to watch where this goes. So, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was a blast.
All right.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
And let's here's where we go to the thanks for watching screen. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for